The envelope was cream-colored, thick, with my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately, the careful, slightly tilted cursive of a woman who had been dead for 8 months. I'm Dulce, though most people who love me call me Dooley. I'm 28 years old, and until approximately 40 minutes before that envelope arrived in my hands, I had been the administrative assistant at Whitford Properties, a $92 million real estate company that my father built and that I had worked in, quietly and without recognition, for 3 years. I say had been because my father had just announced, in front of 140 guests at my sister Miranda's Harvard graduation party, that my position was being eliminated and that I would not be receiving any share of the family estate. He said it into a microphone. There were canapés. I was standing near the back of the ballroom when he said it, white tablecloths, champagne flutes catching the chandelier light, the specific ambient warmth of an event that has cost more than most people earn in a year. Miranda was at the front of the room in a dress that had been selected 3 months in advance, glowing with the particular radiance of a person who has never once doubted that the world was arranged in her favor. My father gestured toward her and said her name, and the room applauded. Then he said mine, briefly, in the way you mention a necessary administrative detail, the kind of thing that needs to be said but doesn't require emphasis. He said that changes were coming to the company's structure, that Miranda would be assuming a leadership role, that certain positions, including the administrative coordinator role currently held by his older daughter, would be consolidated. I watched my mother nod from the front table. She had known. Of course she had known. Something in me went very still in that moment, not the stillness of shock exactly, more like the stillness of a thing that has been falling for a long time and has finally reached the ground. I had been bracing for impact for years. The impact had arrived. And the most honest thing I can tell you is that a part of me, the part that had spent 28 years hoping for something different, went quiet in a way it never had before. I did not cry. I did not leave. I stood near the back of the ballroom with a glass of sparkling water I hadn't drunk, and I waited for the applause to finish, and I thought about my grandmother Eleanor, who had died 8 months earlier and who had looked at me, in her final weeks, with an expression I had not been able to fully read. The man who approached me 20 minutes later was in his early 60s, gray-suited, with reading glasses on a chain and a leather briefcase that looked like it belonged to someone who dealt in serious things. He introduced himself as Jonathan, an attorney from Morrison & Blake. He said he had been waiting for the appropriate moment to deliver something. He handed me the envelope. I looked at my name in Eleanor's handwriting. I looked up at the ballroom, the chandeliers, the white tablecloths, my father still holding court at the front of the room, Miranda laughing at something someone had said. Then I opened it. To understand what was inside that envelope, you need to understand who Eleanor was and who I was in relation to her, which was different from who I was in relation to everyone else in my family. Eleanor Whitford had built the foundation of Whitford Properties before my father ever touched it. She had started with 2 commercial lots in 1971 and spent the following 20 years acquiring, developing, and managing a portfolio that my father inherited at 40 and expanded with the confidence of a man who had never been required to start from nothing. He was good at expansion. He was less good at remembering where the foundation came from. Eleanor was small, precise, and relentlessly observant. She had the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself, the kind that watches and accumulates and saves its conclusions for moments of genuine usefulness. She had watched our family for 28 years. She had watched my father praise Miranda'S grades and mock my reading difficulties. She had watched my mother smile at dinner parties while I struggled to get through a menu. She had watched me spend 3 years in a job that required a fraction of my actual capability, assigned to me by a father who believed, publicly and without embarrassment, that my dyslexia was evidence of a broader limitation that made me unsuitable for anything more demanding. She had watched all of it. And she had been making plans. Looking back, I can see the things she left me that weren't in any document. The way she always asked me to read maps on our drives together, never books, because maps were spatial, not linear, and I was good at them. The way she talked to me about the properties as systems, as relationships between spaces and communities, rather than as numbers on a balance sheet. She was teaching me something for years, and I thought it was just the way she talked. It wasn't. The envelope contained a will. Dated 2019, notarized, witnessed, entirely legal. 22 pages. And on the third page, in language that Jonathan would later explain to me with careful precision, a clause that granted me 51% controlling interest in Whitford Properties, the majority shareholder. I read it twice, standing near the coat check at my sister's graduation party, with the sound of celebration in the room behind me and the cream-colored paper in my hands. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and looked for Jonathan. "When does this take effect?" I asked. "It already has," he said. "As of Eleanor's death 8 months ago. We were waiting for the appropriate moment to present it." He looked at me steadily. "I think you'll agree the timing is appropriate." I looked back at the ballroom. My father was laughing at something. Miranda was accepting a toast. "Schedule an emergency board meeting," I said. "Monday morning." The years before that envelope had their own specific texture, the texture of a life lived slightly smaller than it needed to be, in rooms where the air had been arranged to accommodate everyone except me. I should tell you about the dyslexia first, because it is the architecture of everything that followed. I was diagnosed at 8. My teacher noticed before my parents did, noticed that I was reversing letters, losing my place in lines of text, reading haltingly in a way that wasn't about effort or attention. She referred me to a specialist. The specialist confirmed it. And then my parents, who had different relationships with information that challenged their self-image, processed the diagnosis in different ways. My mother processed it as a social inconvenience, something to be managed quietly, preferably not mentioned at dinner parties. My father processed it as evidence. Evidence of something he had perhaps already suspected, that the older daughter was not going to be the kind of daughter he had imagined. Miranda was 6 at the time, already reading chapter books, already the kind of child whose accomplishments arrived easily and visibly. The contrast was, for my father, apparently clarifying. He never said I was stupid in those exact words. He didn't need to. He had a vocabulary of implication, sighs at report cards, jokes at family dinners about needing someone to read the menu for him, the particular way he introduced us to people. "Miranda is at the top of her class," and, after a pause that did all the necessary work, "and this is Dulce." Christmas 2018 was the one I come back to most often, not because it was the worst, but because it was the clearest. I was 24, working as a receptionist at a property management firm that had nothing to do with Whitford. Eleanor was still alive. She sat at the end of the table with the particular stillness of someone who is paying very close attention. Miranda had just finished her first semester at Harvard. She had brought her semester grades home, and my father had asked her to pass them around the table the way you pass around a photograph of something beautiful. He looked at them, and then looked at me and said, "This is what application looks like." I was eating my soup. I set down the spoon very carefully. Eleanor looked at me from the end of the table, and her expression, I understand it now in a way I couldn't then, was not pity. It was recognition. The look of a person who has seen something clearly and is filing it away. I smiled and said nothing and went back to my soup. I was good at that. Years of practice. I didn't ask myself, at the time, why I kept going to those dinners. The honest answer, which I didn't have access to yet, was that I was still hoping. Still carrying the specific, exhausting hope of a child who believes that if she is patient enough and good enough and present enough, the parent who hasn't seen her will eventually turn around. That hope is the most expensive thing I ever maintained. It cost more than I can calculate. I joined Whitford Properties the following January at 25 because Eleanor suggested it. Not pressured, suggested, in the careful way she offered things that mattered. She said she thought it would be good for me to understand the company from the inside. She said she thought I had instincts for it that hadn't been given room to develop. My father gave me the administrative coordinator role. Filing, scheduling, correspondence management, logistics for property viewings. Work that required organization and attention to detail, which I had in abundance, and which paid just enough to maintain the appearance of family integration without threatening any existing hierarchy. I was good at it. Better than good, I was the person the actual property managers called when something needed to be tracked or coordinated, because I had, over 18 months, developed a mental map of the entire portfolio that very few people at the company possessed. I knew which properties were underperforming and why. I knew which tenants were reliable and which were problems waiting to materialize. I knew the maintenance history of 47 properties by memory, because memory, specifically spatial and relational memory, was something my brain did exceptionally well, even when linear text gave it trouble. Nobody at Whitford Properties knew any of this, because nobody had asked. Eleanor asked. When she visited the office, which she did irregularly, always unannounced, which my father found slightly irritating, she would find me and ask questions that weren't small talk. What did I notice about the Meridian Street portfolio? What did I think about the proposed development on the east side? She listened to my answers with the full quality of her attention, which was a different experience from being listened to by most people. She didn't just receive information. She evaluated it. You see things, she told me once, in the parking garage after one of her visits. The way a building thinks, the way it relates to what's around it. You have that. Don't let anyone convince you that's not intelligence. I had thanked her and gone back inside and filed 17 lease renewal documents and thought about what she'd said for the rest of the afternoon. 3 months later, she was diagnosed with the illness that would take her within the year. She didn't change dramatically toward the end. That was the thing about Eleanor. She had never performed ease, so there was nothing to maintain. She became slightly slower, slightly more deliberate, and the quality of her attention intensified in a way that I felt without being able to describe. When she looked at you in those final months, she was looking at you the way you look at something you're committing to memory. She called me to her house on a Tuesday in March, 7 months before she died. Made tea. Asked me about 2 specific properties, the Alderton warehouse conversion and the Fielding Street residential block, in more detail than she'd ever asked before. Listened to everything I said. Took notes on a yellow legal pad in her precise, tilted handwriting. When I left, she walked me to the door and held my hand for a moment. You know more than you think you do, she said. Remember that. I drove home in the March rain thinking it was the kind of thing people say when they're trying to be kind. I was wrong. It was a transfer of information. She was telling me something I would need. I missed that entirely. Looking back, that Tuesday was the moment she was closing the loop on everything she'd built, the properties, the will, the careful architecture of what she was leaving behind. She was telling me I was ready. I heard it as comfort. The gap between those 2 things is where I lost 8 months I could have been preparing. Eleanor died in October. The funeral was in the first week of November, a gray morning at a small church she'd attended for 40 years, with perhaps 60 people who had known her genuinely and another 30 who came because of the name. I sat 3 rows from the front. My father gave a brief eulogy that was accurate about the facts and said nothing about the person. Miranda cried in a way that was visible from several seats back. My mother wore a hat that was too formal for the occasion, which Eleanor would have found mildly amusing. I didn't cry until I was in my car afterward, alone, with the engine off and the rain starting on the windshield. Not because I was holding it together for the service, I just needed to be somewhere private first. Eleanor had been the one person in my life who looked at me without revision. Without the mental asterisk that said, but remember the dyslexia, remember the limitations, remember that she's not Miranda. Losing that was a specific kind of grief, different from the general grief of losing someone, and it needed space I couldn't create in a church pew. The weeks after the funeral had a strange, suspended quality. My father became busier, more meetings, more time on calls, a compressed energy that I read initially as grief management and later as something else. He had several conversations with the company's board that I knew about only because I processed his calendar. There was a meeting with Robert Hartley, the board chairman, that got rescheduled 3 times in 2 weeks before finally happening on a Thursday evening, after hours, when most of the staff had gone home. I noticed this the way I noticed most things at Whitford, peripherally, without immediately understanding what I was cataloging. I told myself my father was managing the transition. Eleanor had been a silent shareholder. Her death would trigger some structural review. That was the most obvious explanation. I chose it because it was the least alarming. But there was something in the frequency of those rescheduled meetings, the specific pattern of a conversation someone wanted to have in private, that I was already filing somewhere I hadn't yet opened. Margaret Coleman called me in late November. Margaret was 67, a board member since Eleanor's time, the kind of presence in a room that registers as gravity rather than noise. She had been Eleanor's friend before she was a board member, which made her loyalty different in quality from the others. She didn't call the office line. She called my personal number, which I hadn't given her, which meant Eleanor had. "I'd like to have coffee," she said. "Nothing urgent. Just checking in." We met at a cafe 3 blocks from the office on a Wednesday morning. She ordered black coffee and looked at me across the table with an expression that was measuring something. "How are you finding things?" she asked. "Since Eleanor." "Quiet," I said. "Different. Your father has been speaking with Robert quite a bit." I looked at her. "About the estate?" "Among other things." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Dulce, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. Did Eleanor ever speak to you about the company's future structure?" I thought about the Tuesday in March. "The yellow legal pad. You know more than you think you do." "Not specifically," I said. She asked me about properties. About what I noticed. Margaret nodded slowly. The measuring expression didn't change. "She thought very highly of you," she said. "More than you probably knew." Something tightened in my chest, not quite suspicion, not quite hope. Something that occupied the space between the two. "Margaret," I said, "is there something I should know?" She looked at me for a moment. Then, "I think things will become clearer soon. I just wanted to see how you were." She paid for the coffee and left, and I sat at the table for another 20 minutes trying to understand what had just happened. She had told me nothing. She had also, somehow, told me something. I just couldn't read it yet. December brought the annual board review, which I processed the logistics for as I did every year: venue, catering, agenda distribution, document preparation. This year the agenda had a section I hadn't seen before: ownership structure review, post-estate period. My father's assistant had prepared the documents for that section, not me, which was unusual. When I asked about it, she said Gerald had handled it directly. That was the second red flag I walked past. The agenda section about ownership structure, the closed-door meetings with Robert, the documents prepared outside my usual process, each of these was a signal that something was being arranged around me rather than including me. I read them as administrative anomalies. They were preparations. My father was moving pieces on a board whose game I didn't yet know I was playing. Miranda came home for Christmas. She was finishing her final semester, the Harvard degree almost complete, her future apparently already sketched in detail by our parents. She was animated at dinner in a way that had a specific quality, the animation of someone who has been told good news and is enjoying the anticipation of it becoming public. I watched her across the table and felt the familiar geometry of our family reassert itself. Miranda at the center, luminous with her father's approval, me at the edge, present but peripheral, the administrative detail of the family gathering. After dinner, my father asked Miranda to stay for a conversation in his study. He did not ask me. I washed the dishes. My mother dried. She hummed something vague and tuneless and didn't look at me directly, which told me she knew whatever was being discussed in the study and had made her peace with her role in it. "Mom," I said. She looked up. "Is everything okay?" A pause. The specific pause of a woman choosing between honesty and management. "Of course," she said. "Why wouldn't it be?" I handed her a plate to dry and said nothing, and the humming resumed, and I stood at the sink and thought about Eleanor's handwriting and the yellow legal pad and the way Margaret had said, "I think things will become clearer soon." January arrived with the particular bleakness of a month that has nothing to recommend it: gray sky, cold that was more exhausting than dramatic, the post-holiday compression of a world returning to its ordinary requirements. My father called me into his office on the second Thursday of the month. I had been in his office hundreds of times, filing, delivering documents, managing the physical logistics of a space I'd come to know as well as my own apartment. It was a large corner office with windows on 2 sides and a desk that was too big for the actual work it held, the kind of desk that exists to communicate something about the person behind it. He was behind it when I came in, jacket on despite the indoor heating, which was always a sign he was prepared for a formal conversation. "Sit down, Dulce." I sat. He told me about the restructuring in the language of business, consolidated roles, streamlined administration, a new operational model for the company's next phase. He said my position was being eliminated. He said it with the practiced neutrality of a man who had decided something a long time ago and was now delivering the administrative confirmation of it. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Is there a severance package?" He looked slightly surprised. I think he had expected tears, or argument, or some form of the emotional response he'd been managing around for 28 years. "Standard terms," he said. "Jonathan from HR will send the documentation." "Thank you for telling me directly," I said. I stood up, shook his hand, which surprised him further, and walked out of his office and back to my desk, where I spent the next 4 hours completing every outstanding task with the precision and thoroughness that had always characterized my work. And then I organized my files, backed up my documents to my personal drive, and left the building at 5:30. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I had prepared, mentally, for devastation, the specific devastation of being removed from the last structure that connected me to the family, however inadequately. What I felt instead was something more like clarity. A narrowing. As though the room had gotten smaller, but the remaining space was entirely mine. I understood, walking to my car in the January cold, that I had been waiting for permission to stop waiting. He had just given it to me. I called Jonathan Ellis 3 days later. Not the HR Jonathan. Eleanor's Jonathan, Morrison, and Blake, the firm whose letterhead I'd seen on documents in Eleanor's house during the weeks I'd helped organize her affairs after her death. I'd kept his card in my wallet without being entirely sure why. The kind of thing you do when some part of you is paying attention that you haven't acknowledged yet. He answered on the second ring. "Dulce Whitford," he said, as if he'd been expecting the call. "You know who I am," I said. "I've been expecting to hear from you," he said. "Though I confess I thought it might be sooner." A pause. "Eleanor left me something," I said. It wasn't a question. "She did," he said. "I've been waiting for the appropriate moment to deliver it. I think that moment is coming soon." Another pause. "Are you aware that your sister's graduation party is in 6 weeks?" "I know about the party," I said. "Your father intends to make a public announcement at it," he said carefully. "About the company's leadership succession. I became aware of this through channels I won't specify." He paused. "I think it would be appropriate to deliver Eleanor's document at the same event." I sat with that for a moment. The specific architecture of it, the announcement my father planned to make, the document Jonathan had been holding, the same room, the same evening. "She planned this," I said. "Eleanor was a very precise person," he said. "She believed in appropriate timing. Even now, I feel something complicated when I think about this. Eleanor had been gone for 8 months, and she had been orchestrating something that whole time, had been orchestrating it, in fact, for years before her death. She had seen what my father was going to do before he did it. She had built a response before the wound arrived. That kind of love, the kind that prepares for your protection rather than simply hoping for the best, was so different from what I'd grown up inside that it took me weeks to fully receive it. I met with Jonathan in his office the following week. He showed me the will. All 22 pages. He walked me through each clause with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the document he was explaining would reorganize someone's entire life and deserved to be explained properly. The 51% controlling interest. The specific language about trustee responsibilities and shareholder rights. The clause that stated, plainly, that no subsequent document executed without Dulce Whitford's knowledge or consent could diminish or transfer her majority stake. My father had been meeting with Robert Hartley about ownership structure. He had been preparing documents outside my usual administrative process. He had been building what he thought was a clean transfer of the company's future to Miranda. Eleanor had anticipated all of it. "He doesn't know," I said. "No one at Whitford Properties knows," Jonathan confirmed. Eleanor registered the will with the court, but kept the details private. "Your father's attorneys have been working from the assumption that Eleanor's estate was handled through the 2012 will, which left her shares divided among her children." He looked at me. The 2019 will supersedes it entirely. I looked at the document on the table between us. Margaret Coleman knows, I said. It wasn't a question either. He allowed himself a small smile. Margaret has known since 2019. She was one of the witnesses. I thought about the coffee. I think things will become clearer soon. She was watching to see if I was ready, I said. She was watching to see if you were who Eleanor believed you were, Jonathan said. I think she's satisfied. The 6 weeks between that meeting and the graduation party had a different quality from anything that had come before. I wasn't waiting anymore, I was preparing. The distinction mattered enormously. Waiting is passive, exhausting, a sustained act of hope directed at something outside your control. Preparing is the opposite, directed, energizing, the specific satisfaction of a person who finally knows what she's working toward. I spent those weeks learning the will with the thoroughness I brought to everything I actually cared about. I read it until its language was familiar, until I could anticipate each clause, until the document felt less like a revelation and more like a tool I knew how to use. Jonathan met with me twice more, walking through shareholder rights and board procedures and the specific legal steps required to call and convene an emergency meeting. Margaret joined us for the second meeting, and the three of us sat around a conference table at Morrison and Blake for 3 hours, building the architecture of what came next. Margaret was exactly who I'd suspected she was: precise, strategic, entirely committed to Eleanor's intentions. She told me about the board's current composition, the members who were Gerald's appointments and the members who were Eleanor's original selections, and therefore more likely to evaluate the situation on its merits. She told me about Robert Hartley, who was Gerald's ally, but a man who, in her experience, responded to legal clarity over personal loyalty when the stakes were high enough. He'll resist, she said, speaking of my father. But he won't have grounds. The will is unambiguous. I know, I said. She looked at me with Eleanor's expression, the evaluating one, the one that was looking for something specific. You're not afraid, she said. It was an observation, not a question. I thought about it honestly. I'm nervous, I said. But not afraid. There's a difference. She nodded. Eleanor said you'd say something like that. What I felt in those weeks, I've tried to describe accurately, and I'm not sure I've succeeded. It wasn't revenge. The word implies a heat I didn't feel. It was more like correction. The sense of a long-running error being brought back into alignment. My father had built a picture of me over 28 years, a picture in which my worth was limited and my capability was secondary and my presence in the company was a courtesy extended to someone who couldn't quite manage more. That picture was wrong. Eleanor had known it was wrong. In 6 weeks, it was going to be replaced by something accurate. I bought a dress for the party. Not the kind of dress I usually wore to family events, something chosen to be unobtrusive, to blend into the background. A different one. Navy, structured, the kind of thing that occupies a room with quiet authority. When I tried it on in the store, I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment and thought, this is the last time I'll walk into that family as an afterthought. The graduation party was held at the Meridian, one of Whitford Properties' own event venues, which my father had booked with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoys using his own resources to display his own success. 140 guests. White tablecloths, a string quartet during cocktail hour, the kind of catering that signals seriousness without ostentation. I arrived alone, 10 minutes after the official start time, and Jonathan was already there, positioned near the coat check, briefcase at his side. With the composed patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and is not going to rush it now that it's arrived. He nodded when he saw me. I nodded back. We didn't speak yet. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and moved through the room. I spoke to people I knew, my father's associates, some board members, old family friends, and I was present and pleasant and entirely myself in a way I hadn't been at family events in years. The performance of smallness I'd maintained in these rooms for so long simply wasn't available to me anymore. I had used it up. What was left was just me in the navy dress, drinking sparkling water and waiting. My father gave his speech at 7:30. I was near the back, as I had been at every family event where the center was not meant for me. I listened to the praise of Miranda, her academic achievement, her character, her future role in the company, with a quality of attention that was new. Not the numb attention of someone absorbing something painful, but the alert attention of someone watching a story reach its end. When he said my name, the brief, administrative mention of the role elimination, delivered to 140 people as if it were a minor operational detail, I felt 100 pairs of eyes move to me with various expressions of discomfort, pity, and in some cases, badly concealed satisfaction. I met none of them. I looked at my father, standing at the front of the room with his microphone and his certainty, and I thought about Eleanor's handwriting on the cream-colored envelope. The applause for Miranda finished. The program moved on to cocktails and conversation. And Jonathan materialized at my side. "Now," he asked quietly. "Now," I said. He handed me the envelope. I opened it. I had read it dozens of times by this point, but I opened it in the room because the opening of it mattered, and I looked at my name in Eleanor's handwriting one more time. Then I found my father. He was near the bar with Robert Hartley and 2 other board members, the particular cluster of a man in his natural environment. He saw me approaching, and his expression cycled through something, not alarm, not yet, just the low-level irritation of someone whose choreography is being interrupted. "Dulce," he said. "This isn't really the time. I'd like to introduce you to someone," I said. "You already know Jonathan Ellis, I think." He was Eleanor's attorney. My father looked at Jonathan. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, a first edge of unease. "Jonathan," he said carefully. "Gerald." Jonathan opened his briefcase and produced a document, a formal copy, notarized, the kind that exists specifically to be presented in moments like this. "I have a court-registered will executed by Eleanor Whitford in March 2019, superseding all previous testamentary documents. I've been waiting for an appropriate moment to present it to the relevant parties." He looked at my father steadily. "I believe this is the appropriate moment." The bar conversation had gone quiet. Robert Hartley was watching with an expression that had abandoned its social performance entirely and settled into something more careful and assessing. My father took the document. "Read the first page. Then the third." I watched his face. There is a specific expression that crosses a person's face when they encounter information that dismantles a structure they believed was solid, not quite shock, not quite anger, but the look of someone watching a floor they were standing on reveal that it was never the floor at all. My father had that expression for perhaps 4 seconds before his training reasserted itself and his face became controlled again. For seconds was enough. I had been looking for that expression my whole life, not to cause it, but to understand it. To understand that the certainty he had always projected about me, about my worth and my limitations, had never been as solid as he made it appear. "This is," he started. "51% controlling interest," I said. "Registered with the court in October 2019. Effective from the date of Eleanor's death." I looked at him. Not with anger, I want to be precise about that. With clarity. "I'd like to schedule an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. Jonathan has the agenda." Robert Hartley spoke first among the board members present. "Gerald, I think we need to." "I understand," my father said. His voice had changed, flatter, more careful, stripped of its usual authority by the simple fact of a legal document he hadn't anticipated. "We'll meet Monday." I looked at him for a moment longer. "Thank you for the party," I said. And I meant it, not sarcastically, just plainly. It was, in fact, the appropriate venue for this. Eleanor had understood that. I walked away, and behind me I heard the low, urgent murmur of several conversations beginning at once. Miranda found me on the terrace 20 minutes later. She had come outside alone, which was unusual for her. Miranda was a person who used other people as context, who was most comfortable with witnesses. Coming to find me without them was a choice that cost her something. She looked different up close than she had at the front of the room. The graduation glow had been replaced by something more complicated, a person trying to process several things simultaneously and not quite managing any of them. "You knew," she said. "Not accusatory. Just establishing a fact." "I found out 6 weeks ago," I said. "Is it?" She stopped. "Is it real?" "The will." "It's real," I said. Eleanor made it very carefully. Miranda was quiet for a moment. The city below us was doing what cities do at night, moving, lit, indifferent to the specific drama on this particular terrace. She never told me, she said finally, about what she thought of things. What she thought of, she stopped again. She was always kinder to you. I noticed that, and I thought it was just grandmother things. I didn't understand why. She saw things clearly, I said. She thought I was. Miranda looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on her face, something genuinely uncertain, stripped of its usual performance. She thought Dad was wrong. About you. She thought we all were. I looked at her. 28 years of being the secondary daughter, the administrative detail, the one who read slowly and filed efficiently and was never going to be what the family needed her to be. And here was my sister, in her graduation dress, on a terrace, telling me something that cost her something real to say. Yes, I said. She did. Miranda looked at the city for a moment. Then, I'm sorry, Dulce. I mean that. She turned to look at me. I've said things at dinners, to friends, following Dad's lead because it was easier than questioning it. I'm sorry. I sat with that apology in the night air, and I let myself feel what it actually was: imperfect, late, but genuine. The genuineness mattered. I had spent a long time believing that the people in my family were incapable of seeing me clearly, and Miranda standing on a terrace saying she was sorry was evidence that the incapacity wasn't permanent. It was a choice they'd been making, which meant it was a choice that could be unmade. I know, I said. We'll figure out what comes next. Not tonight. She nodded. We stood for a while longer in the quiet of the terrace, two sisters with a complicated history and an uncertain future, and the city moved below us without comment. The Monday board meeting lasted 4 hours. I won't give you every procedural detail: the verification of the will's authenticity, the legal review Jonathan had already prepared, the careful presentation of each relevant clause. What I will tell you is that Robert Hartley, who my father had considered his most reliable ally, read the document with the attention of a man who understood that his professional obligations superseded his personal ones. And at the end of the legal review he said, "The will is clear. We need to discuss the governance implications." My father tried twice to reframe the situation, once as a procedural anomaly, once as a matter requiring further legal review before any board action. Both times Jonathan responded with the quiet, factual precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly these objections and had never been alarmed by them. Margaret Coleman spoke once, briefly, near the end of the discussion. She said she had been a witness to the 2019 will and had complete confidence in its validity and in Eleanor's intentions. She looked at my father when she said it, and the look contained something that had probably been in her for a long time. The vote of no confidence in Gerald's continued role as CEO passed 6-2. He resigned 2 days later, in a letter that was formal and brief and contained nothing personal. I read it in Jonathan's office and felt the specific weight of it settle into something real, not victory, not relief, just the acknowledgement that something large had moved and the world had reorganized itself around the movement. The weeks after the board meeting had a quality I'd never experienced before: the quality of a life being lived on its own terms for the first time. I didn't move into my father's corner office. That felt wrong in ways I didn't need to analyze at length. I wasn't replacing him. I was beginning something different. I took a smaller office on the same floor, one with a window that looked over the east side of the city, toward the neighborhoods where several of the portfolio's residential properties stood. Properties I knew by memory. Properties I had been thinking about for 3 years in ways no one had ever asked me to share. My first formal act as majority shareholder was to commission a portfolio review, not a financial audit, which existed already, but a community impact assessment. What were the properties contributing to their neighborhoods? Where were they falling short? What did sustainable development actually mean for a company that managed 47 buildings across a city that was changing faster than most of its residents could afford? I hired a team of 3, including a woman named Susan who had a background in urban planning and the specific gift of translating complex spatial thinking into language other people could act on. She reminded me, in small ways, of Eleanor. Margaret became my primary board ally, not in a manipulative sense, but in the sense of someone who understood the company's history from the inside and whose judgment I trusted to be calibrated toward something beyond short-term financial performance. We had coffee most Thursday mornings, a ritual that established itself without being planned. What I understood, in those first months of genuine authority, was that Eleanor hadn't given me the company as a gift. She'd given it as a responsibility, one she believed I was suited for in ways that had nothing to do with credentials or appearances or the performance of intelligence that my family had always valued over its substance. She'd seen something in the way I talked about buildings, about communities, about the relationship between a property and the people who used it. She'd built her trust on that. The weight of it was real, and I carried it carefully. My father called in April. 3 months after the board meeting, on a Sunday afternoon, his name on my phone screen. I looked at it for a moment before answering. He sounded different, quieter, with the specific quality of a man who has had several months to sit with something and has arrived at something like honesty through a process that clearly hadn't been comfortable. He said he had been wrong. Not specifically, he didn't inventory his failures or name particular moments. He said he had been wrong about me in ways he was still understanding, and that he was sorry. I listened to all of it. "I know," I said when he finished. "Thank you for saying it. He paused. "I'd like to have dinner. If you're willing." I thought about it. Not the reflexive yes that would have come from the old arrangement, the version of me who showed up to whatever was asked because not showing up cost more than going. A genuine consideration. "Not yet," I said. "I need more time. But I'll let you know when I'm ready." He said he understood. He said he'd wait. I hung up and sat in my office for a while, in the afternoon light, and thought about what not yet meant. It meant something had been left open. Not the old door. That one had a different shape now, a different weight. A new one, with its hinges still being tested. That phone call was when I finally understood the difference between forgiveness and permission. I had spent years granting permission to dismiss me, to define me, to make me the administrative detail of my own family. Forgiveness is different. It doesn't restore the old arrangement. It releases the debt without reinstating the dynamic. I could forgive my father without giving him back the access he'd had before. That distinction, which sounds simple, took me most of my life to arrive at. Miranda and I had dinner in May. Her choice of restaurant, a place downtown that she'd been to with friends, comfortable and unpretentious in a way that felt deliberate. She was trying. That mattered. We talked for 2 hours about things we'd never talked about, what her Harvard years had actually been like, beneath the performance of them. What it had felt like to be the favored child, which was not entirely the uncomplicated advantage it appeared from the outside. She'd spent her own kind of energy maintaining the position, always performing, always achieving, always terrified of the moment she might not be enough. "We were both trapped," she said. "Just in different kinds." "Yes," I said. "I didn't see yours," she said. "I should have." "I didn't see yours either," I said honestly. We were quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around us. "Can we?" she started. "I mean, I don't expect everything to be fine immediately. But can we try?" "We're already trying," I said. "This is what trying looks like." She smiled. It was a real one, not the performance smile I knew from family events, but something more uncertain and, therefore, more genuine. "Eleanor would have something dry to say about all of this," she said. "She would," I agreed. "She'd probably say she told us so." Summer arrived. The Sustainable Development Division launched officially in June. A press release, a brief presentation to the board, a team of 7 people who were genuinely excited about the work. The Alderton warehouse conversion, which I had been thinking about for 3 years, became the division's first project, mixed-income residential units above commercial space, designed in consultation with the surrounding neighborhood rather than in spite of it. I stood at the groundbreaking in July, in a hard hat that looked slightly too large for me, with Susan and the construction team and 2 board members and a journalist from a local development publication who was writing a piece about the company's new direction. The journalist asked me how I'd arrived at the sustainable development focus. "My grandmother built this company on an understanding of what buildings actually do for people," I said. "I'm trying to get back to that." "Were you always interested in this side of the business?" I thought about my father's corner office, the filing systems, the 3 years of administrative work I'd done while mapping a portfolio I wasn't allowed to strategize about. "Yes," I said. "I just wasn't always in a position where it was visible." There's a photograph from the groundbreaking that I keep on my desk. Not the formal one, the candid shot the journalist's photographer took when I wasn't looking, when I was talking to Susan about something in the site plans. I'm laughing at something she said, and the hard hat is slightly crooked, and behind me you can see the facade of the Alderton building with its new scaffolding catching the July afternoon light. I look like myself in it. Entirely, only myself, no asterisk, no revision, no performance of someone else's expectation. Eleanor has been gone almost 2 years. I talk to her sometimes, internally, when I'm working through something difficult. Not asking for answers, she left me the tools for finding those myself. More like reporting back. Here's what I did with what you gave me. Here's what I'm still learning. My dyslexia hasn't changed. I still read slowly. I still use spatial memory for things that other people use text for. I still have days when a document that should take 20 minutes takes an hour, and the frustration of that is as real as it ever was. But it is one fact about how my brain works, and it coexists with other facts, with a spatial intelligence that lets me see a portfolio as a living system, with a relational memory that means I know every tenant situation in 47 buildings, with a quality of attention to the physical world that my grandmother recognized and that I am, slowly, recognizing in myself. What I carry forward is not the vindication. That was a moment, and moments pass. What I carry is the understanding that other people's definitions of you are not yours to maintain. That the story someone tells about your limitations is not evidence about your limitations. It is evidence about them, about what they needed you to be, about the picture they required. My father needed me to be the lesser daughter because the alternative required him to examine something about himself he wasn't willing to examine. That was his work to do, not mine to accommodate. The East Side neighborhood, on a Tuesday morning in late summer, looks exactly like what it is, a city in the process of becoming something. I sit at my desk with my window and my coffee and my files and my photograph, and I do the work Eleanor believed I could do, and I do it in my own way, at my own pace, in my own mind's language. It is enough. More than enough. It is, finally, exactly what it was always supposed to be. What this story reveals, at the level beneath its inheritance drama and boardroom resolution, is something precise about the relationship between identity and authority, specifically. What happens when someone else's authority over your self-definition is the primary structure your life has been built inside, and what it costs, and what it takes, to dismantle it. Gerald's treatment of Dulce was not random cruelty. It was a system, consistent, self-reinforcing, and economically rational from his perspective. A daughter he believed was limited required no investment of expectation, no risk of disappointment, no revision of his self-image as a man who built things and passed them to worthy successors. By defining Dulce's dyslexia as evidence of broader limitation, he simplified his own emotional accounting. The system worked because Dulce, for 28 years, partially accepted the account. Not fully. She built a company map no one asked for. She noticed patterns no one was tracking, but enough to remain in the role assigned to her, enough to keep showing up to dinners where her presence was administrative rather than meaningful. What Eleanor understood, and what the story demonstrates through the specific content of her preparations, is that Dulce's capabilities were not hidden. They were simply operating in a context designed not to see them. The yellow legal pad, the questions about properties as systems, the Tuesday conversations that functioned as quiet tutorials, Eleanor was not manufacturing Dulce's competence. She was creating conditions in which it could become visible. The will was not a rescue, it was a delivery mechanism for something Dulce had already earned. The Miranda relationship is the story's most psychologically nuanced thread. Favoritism damages both its recipients and its targets, but differently. Miranda received approval without accountability, which meant she arrived at 24 with a beautiful resume and a deep structural anxiety about whether she could sustain the performance that had always generated her worth. Her apology on the terrace was genuine precisely because it came without benefit. Dulce already held the power, so Miranda's acknowledgement of her own role in the family's dynamic could not be strategic. It was just honest. That honesty was the beginning of something real between them, and the story treats it with appropriate care, not as reconciliation achieved, but as reconciliation begun. The board meeting, which is the story's structural climax, is worth examining for what it was not. It was not a scene of public humiliation or revenge. Dulce presented a legal document and requested a governance conversation. The drama was generated not by anything she did, but by the gap between what her father believed was true and what actually was, the same gap that had defined their relationship for 2 decades, now simply made visible in a formal context. That restraint is the story's moral spine. She had every instrument available for destruction and used none of them. She used a will, a boardroom, and a clear statement of what she intended to do going forward. The difference between those two approaches is the difference between vengeance and integrity. What the story ultimately argues is that the most durable form of vindication is not the moment your antagonist is forced to acknowledge your worth, it's the moment you stop needing them to. Dulce's real freedom didn't arrive with the board vote. It arrived earlier, in the weeks of preparation, when she stopped being a person waiting for permission and became a person executing a plan. The party, the envelope, the meeting, these were the public acknowledgement of something that had already changed internally. And that sequence, private change preceding public acknowledgement, is the story's truest account of how people actually free themselves from the stories that were built to contain them. What I keep returning to is the yellow legal pad. Eleanor sitting in her kitchen, taking notes on what Dulce said about the buildings, in handwriting that would later appear on an envelope that changed everything. She wasn't doing that for the record. She was doing it because she wanted Dulce to see herself being taken seriously, even if only in a kitchen, even if only by one person, even if that person was the only one in the family paying the right kind of attention. Sometimes the most important thing someone can do for you is simply refuse to accept the diminished version of you that everyone else has agreed on. Eleanor refused. Quietly, for years, without announcing it, she just kept looking at Dulce as if the real version was the only version worth seeing. That's what I think is most worth carrying from this story. Not the inheritance, not the boardroom, just the knowledge that being truly seen by even one person can be enough to remember who you actually are.